Well, it's 2 o'clock, everybody, and it's a great pleasure for me to introduce this MICRA webinar on aging in the context of global migrations. My name's Chris Phillipson, and I'm co-director of the Manchester Institute for Collaborative Research into Aging, which is hosting this webinar. And I'm really pleased to do so, and I was asked by Tanya Bastia from the University of Manchester, who is the driving force behind this event, and I'm very grateful to Tanya. Just a bit of background, I think, to this discussion, and perhaps 4 kind of areas that have been driving the debate about migration and transnational migration as it affects older people. Firstly, of course, the impact of globalization on older people, which we've been discussing, I think, increasingly. Secondly, different types of migration movements across the world, which impact older people in very different ways, and teasing some of those out is one of the purposes behind this session. Thirdly, of course, new types of inequalities within the context of migration. I think that's very important. Within different groups of older people, certainly not a homogeneous group, people facing different inequalities, different parts of the world. And fourthly, of course, new ways of managing migration amongst older people, their carers and their families, and fascinating research, I think, which we're going to see today on this. 3 key research questions which the webinar is exploring. What does it mean to age while your children are abroad? How is this experience of migration different for older adults? And what is involved in transnational care? So I think those are the kind of key themes we're exploring. And we have a great lineup of speakers who are going to address this issue. Couple of housekeeping points. The session is recorded and will be available on the MICRA website, I think, sometime next week. There are 3 presentations, and I'm going to go through those or introduce the speakers in turn, and we'll have questions at the end. So if you could save your questions at the end in the chat function, that would be great. So if we could go straight away into the first session with Farid, Mia, and Professor Russell King. Just a brief introduction. Farid is a postdoc fellow at Sussex, University of Sussex. He's worked on a range of issues relating to transnational issues, migration, especially in terms of mobilities between Bangladesh and the London diaspora. And Professor Russell King, and Russell, of course, has produced a very wide range of studies relating to transnational migration, has really been one of the leaders in developing this area in all sorts of directions, and pleasure to have both of you on this. So Farid, over to you.
Okay, actually, it's going to be me who's speaking.
Oh, Russell, I do apologise. You're going to lead off.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is a joint paper between Farid and myself. I want to stress that Farid is really the first author and the main kind of mover and shaker behind this paper. But he persuaded me to make the presentation because I can speak quicker than him, was his persuasion. So that's how we're going to proceed. I mean, I'm sure Farid will chip in with answers to the questions that come from the discussion later on. So if we can move to the context of this research and the key research question. The research is based on a long established migration corridor between the Bangladeshi region of Sylhet in northeast Bangladesh, and London, and particularly the East London, which is the focus for the Bangladeshi community in the UK. This is a community that has been quite widely studied. I mean, most notably perhaps by Katie Gardner, and her landmark book published nearly 20 years ago on age, narrative and migration specifically addressed the question of what it was to be an older Bangladeshi migrant in East London. Many other people have also contributed to studies of Bangladeshis in the UK, people like John Eade, Benji Zeitlin, Claire Alexander, and indeed our chair, Chris Phillipson, who's also made significant contributions with co-workers into studying this community. So our key research question is about how experiences and imaginaries of aging are manifested in different locations in this British Bangladeshi diaspora or transnational community. And what we do is to study via quite a large range of interviews, part of which was Farid's PhD thesis, but we have tried to top that up with some follow-up interviews, although that's particularly difficult at the present moment of the pandemic. But we kind of identify three main groups. The first generation older Bangladeshis who migrated in the 60s and 70s and who are now in London who are aging in place. And then the older Bangladeshis in Sylhet who have not migrated, but because they have sons and daughters who are part of that transnational community, and therefore they have their own experiences of aging in place, but in a different place. And then finally, a small group of retirement return migrants who have decided to go back to Sylhet upon retirement from London. As we'll see presently, this is an entirely male group. Because of the limitations of time, I'm going to mainly focus on the narrative of one informant, Kabir. Sometimes when you're doing research, you have one informant and maybe several informants who are just perfect interviewees, and basically they kind of say it all. They say what everybody else says, and as a result, they are, key interviewees. And for the sake of a bit of a sort of biographical thread, we privilege Kabir's narrative throughout our presentation. We have two sets of analytical themes which run through this presentation, and I should also say that this presentation is actually based on a nearly finished paper which we're doing for the special issue of GEMS, which Dora Sampaio and Mega Amrith are co-editing on southern reconfigurations of the aging migration nexus. So we have models of aging, the well-known kind of Western model, for want of a better term, of active aging, where successful aging is seen as active aging based on sort of individual self-reliance and physical activity and so on. A much more family-based, also, as it happens, patriarchal model, which still characterizes Bangladeshi rural society, and specifically in Sylhet, which is the origin region for nearly all of the Bangladeshi community in East London. And then the transposition of this family model to London via migration. So that's the kind of one set of analytical themes. And we weave through that three kind of threads of analysis. The issue of transnational familyhood, family solidarity and care of older people across a long distance transnational space where family care is separated by distance and across generations. Access to mobility of various kinds, migration, return migration, visiting, and so on. And then thirdly, there's quite a strong gender lens, which I hope will kind of emerge as I go through the presentation. Okay, so the next slide then is Kabir's kind of summing up of aging amongst Bangladeshis in London. And rather than read the quotes out, because I'm sure that you can actually read them much quicker than I can sort of read them myself or spell them out, I'm just going to sort of pick out a couple of highlights from the quotes, knowing that you will be able to read them as I speak. Hopefully you can read and listen to what I say at the same time. And what Kabir does is basically to describe a model of pretty inactive aging, whereby once people reach retirement age in their 60s, they largely sit around at home, don't do any physical activities, they become housebound. And he contrasts this in the second part of the quote with what he observes around East London of other ethnic communities who inhabit that area, who he sees are out, going to the gym, going for walks, jogging along the banks of the Thames, and so on. So he draws this immediate contrast between a rather inactive perception of the Bangladeshi style of aging with not just the broader UK population, but specifically other groups as well. And then when we move to the next slide, he describes what the kind of social focus of older people are. And it becomes clear from his narrative, although he doesn't actually specify this, that he's only talking about older men whose socialization is focused around the mosque. He says that when you go to the mosque, you mainly see older men there. For them, it's their main kind of community focus. But then in the second part of that interview clip, you can see rather interestingly how he does acknowledge that doing your prayers up to 5 times a day is a kind of very gentle form of gymnastic exercise, because you're standing and kneeling and stretching and sitting and then walking backwards and forwards to the mosque. And so there is, I think, an interesting little kind of side angle on physical exercise there through the practice of visiting and socializing at the mosque. But it's clear that that's a male view. And then in the next quote, you'll see how Kabir tries to describe in a very masculinist perspective what he thinks the style of aging of older women are, I mean, including presumably his wife and other family members that he observes. So the women are even more inactive, according to him. They don't go out independently like their husbands do. They seem to spend all their time at home. If they go out, they're always accompanied. They don't like visiting the homeland. They spend a lot of time watching TV, according to him. And so for them, for women, staying at home, doing their prayers at home, watching TV and spending time with grandchildren, that's the routine, in his view, of older Bangladeshi women. We have to admit that we didn't interview any older women, and this is where Chris Phillipson's research comes in. But that's something that perhaps we can leave for discussion. So part of successful aging from the point of view of the men, but less so of the women, is visiting the homeland. And we have written a separate paper on this, which is quoted at the bottom and then quoted in the references to the end of this presentation. And so Kabir continues that some of us older British Bangladeshi men like to go on lengthy trips to Bangladesh, particularly to escape the cold British winter. And then in the second part of that quote, he kind of describes how the experience of aging in Bangladesh is slightly different and actually better in his view than it is in London, because back in Bangladesh, men are, they have more respect in rural society. They're called upon to mediate conflicts. They're given a specific social role and to preside over various local social events. And for them, it's a kind of more social and more active and more responsible, let's say, experience. They can go to the local market, spend time with their friends. You can meet people of your own age very easily, he says. You just need to step out onto the road or go to the tea shop round the corner. So he's there presenting quite a nostalgic vision of old age for men, at least, back in the homeland. But that's very much a male perspective. So looking now a little bit more carefully at the issue of transgenerational care, we have a number of types of visits. The one that I just described of the older men largely going on their own, or often going on their own to Bangladesh to escape the winter. But most older generation Bangladeshis who arrived in Britain as part of that sort of early cohort who arrived in the early post-war decades they will essentially age in place in London, because they will be surrounded, as it were, by their multi-generational households with children and grandchildren, either living nearby or indeed in the same household. For more recent visits, those who arrived, let's say, post-1980s, and who are therefore younger first-generation migrants, their parents will still be alive and be back in Sylhet, which produces another kind of challenge of transnational, transgenerational care. And here visits often take place under somewhat different scenarios. It's less about nostalgia and going back and kind of reclaiming your past memories. It's more about looking after and caring for your parents, either in terms of a series of routine visits or visits which take place in times of emergencies. And the two quotes there from Falguni and Masood, both of whom are this kind of intermediate generation, this midlife generation, if you will, that have both children in the UK and parents back in the home country. Those two quotes speak of these emergency trips where old age and in the first case, imminent death prompt a quick return visit. Type 2 visits, on the other hand, are what we call reverse transnational visiting. And these are made by the non-migrant parents of the migrants to their children and grandchildren in London. These visits face three main obstacles we have found. Firstly, the health status of the older migrants. They have to be in sufficiently good health to be able to make the trip. Secondly, within the family somewhere, there needs to be the resource, the money to pay for the expensive tickets. And thirdly, there is the barrier of getting a visa to enter the UK. And this has become increasingly more difficult in the context of the UK's hostile environment towards immigration, and more evidence we have collected that these visits are more and more difficult, in some cases impossible, because of the difficulty of securing a visa. So if we just look at one case, this is the case now of Debu. We're moving to somebody else, a retired teacher from Sylhet. He describes in this quote his visit to London a few years ago. He describes how he was welcomed and received by his son at the airport with a whole pile of warm clothes immediately to put on. But then he relates what we think is a really interesting aspect of what can be regarded as successful aging, because as a former teacher, he was welcomed also by a lot of his students who were migrants in London, and they put on a special reception for him, flooded him with praise, and he said he was overwhelmed and on a wider context enjoyed every minute over there. And then he goes on to make another interesting observation about how these visits are learning experiences as well for the older migrants, how their eyes are opened to a kind of different world, and it's a world that they read about. Of course, and as a teacher, he was an avid reader and follower of the British way of life. But then, of course, when you get there, you realise that to some extent it does conform to the impression, and to some extent it's different. And then he makes a comment about being able to take what he's learnt back to Bangladesh in the form of, I suppose you could call it following Peggy Levitt. I'm sorry?
Couple of minutes.
Yeah, this is I think the penultimate slide. So yeah. So then the final group that we've studied are the returnees, a small subset of our overall sample. All men had migrated to Sylhet, or like Kabir were about to do so, or were planning to do so. So in the first part of this quote, he describes how his intention is to go back to Bangladesh, at least for the major part of the year. He nostalgically refers to this as being his desh, his homeland, his home village where he grew up, and where he still has, he thinks, at least lots of friends, businesses to run, and how life there when he returns will be so much richer for him, at least, than staying in the UK. But then, having said all that, he goes on to say there's the issue of health, and then the issue of what his other family members feel. And he relates how his wife does not agree with this, how she doesn't want him to go, and how she wants to stay put. How she, in fact, has had significant health concerns, but that does not seem to prevent him from wanting to basically bugger off and go and live in Bangladesh. And he also relates how his children are opposed to this as well. At the end of that quote, he says, you know, they are like, why the hell would you want to go and live in Bangladesh because all your family is here? Okay, so just summing up some concluding points. Aging amongst the British Bangladeshi community is very much focused still around the multi-generational family, as Katie Gardner pointed out 20 years ago, and not that much has changed since then. Secondly, I think we can draw an interesting distinction between successful and active aging. In the sort of standard Western gerontological model, successful aging means active aging. In the Bangladeshi model, both in Bangladesh and also in the UK, successful aging means a kind of much more relaxed aging, surrounded and supported by family members, where being active in the social domain rather than the physical domain, and being respected and being cared for is, you know, are the main aspects of that model of aging. Thirdly, we see a distinct gendering of all mobility processes, migration at the beginning, but that's a more historical story, visiting and also return migration. Fourthly, health is a major concern, which absolutely tempers decisions regarding return and visits, because the quality of healthcare in Bangladesh is regarded as so poor compared to London. And then finally, and this picks up a point, well, many of the points I've made, I think, pick up points that Chris made in his introduction. There's a fundamental inequality in access to mobility, because Bangladeshis in the UK who have UK citizenship are pretty free to come and go back to the homeland, but their relatives in the homeland who don't have British citizenship, of course, face increasing barriers towards coming to visit their family members in London. So that rounds up our presentation. Thank you very much for your attention. Here's some of the key literature that I referred to: Katie Gardner's book, Farid's PhD thesis, a couple of papers that we've done together in the last year or so, and some other work that Farid is doing independently, and a couple of references to work that I'm doing with Francesco Della Pupa at the University of Venice on the Italian Bangladeshis who are onward migrating to the UK.
Russell, thanks very much. Thanks very much. Russell and Farid, thanks. Really important issues, and particularly in relation to gender, actually. I think we could have a fascinating discussion on that issue, but we must go on to the next paper from Louis Mercier. Louis has a background in migration and development studies, also an interest in human rights, and he's conducted studies of older people in Ecuador and Peru whose children have moved abroad, I think raising some really important issues in that work, which I think are really part of this whole discussion about transnational migration. So over to you.
Thank you, Christopher. Can you see my presentation now?
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, thank you, Tanya, for organizing the seminar, and thank you all for joining us. I am going to present my paper, Living with the Fear of Dying Without Seeing What Family Gain. And my aim is really to start exploring the role of death and funerals in the so-called aging migration home nexus. I am particularly interested in understanding how people experience the fear of dying or the death of their relatives and the impossibility to attend their funerals, and how that changed the link between aging, migration, and home. I am drawing on the experience of Ecuadorians and Peruvians and transnational migrants living in Madrid, Spain, Manchester and London in the UK, and some of their significant others living in different cities of Ecuador and Peru. So in order to make sense of these transnational connections, I have a research question for those who are aging in place and one for those who are aging in the migrants' countries of origin. The first question is related to how do people aging in migrants' countries of origin experience home when they fear dying without meeting their family living abroad again? And the second interrelated question is how do migrants experience home after leaving significant other behind for many years and when not being able to attend their funerals? I am, in terms of the conceptual framework, I am really dealing with several concepts. I don't pretend just to provide many ideas about this, just to give you an idea of the tensions in the literature. So I am drawing on the idea of aging, and primarily, and by the way, I'm Professor Russell King research on aging that really highlight that aging rather than a number over 60, 17 or whatever is more a sociocultural constructions that emerge in place. I mean, the people aging in Spain or in the UK, where the figure could be completely different cases for those who are aging in cities in Peru or Ecuador. I am using primarily the idea of transnational migration, very inspired by the already classic book by Peggy Levy, just trying to understand how people connect places and develop attachment to different homes in different contexts beyond borders. And also using this concept of transnational, of people living within transnational family by Vincent Horn in his book about Peruvian migrants indeed. And also on this very idea of home, I am very inspired by the so-called critical geographies of home. I am primarily quoting Alison Bloom, Robin Dowling, Catherine Brickell, and sorry for the self-reference, drawing also on my previous research on home with internally displaced people. So I am conceptualizing home in this particular piece of research as a multidimensional, relational, and dynamic space. The idea of multidimensional means that home is material and symbolic at the same time. And in particular, home can be set, for example, in a physical shelter, in a house, but can be also experienced as an existential or even a spiritual space. I will give some more details about that based on my empirical findings. Then I am suggesting that home is a relational space, which means that it's connected to ideas of family and community. As the title of my presentation suggests, family is so central in the experience of home for the people I have been working with. So I really want to explore what is that in terms of the fear of dying or not attending funerals. And finally, the idea of dynamic home suggests that even when you live in a single place your entire life, as some of the people I have interviewed in Peru and Ecuador, maybe you may struggle to feel at home because your idea of home or your attitudes toward home change over time. And that are shaped, that is my argument, by, for example, the death of relatives of the migration of others. So the question here is, in this slide, is how death and funerals complicate all these tensions in the literature, because we are talking about the aging migration home nexus, but we need to be aware that there are many nexuses within them. So, for example, if we look at the relationship between aging and migration, we have very significant research about what is the experience of them. And my interest is to see, to one extent, those scholars, even when the aim of the research is not talking about death and funerals, to one extent, the narratives they are providing in their research suggest that death and funerals are significant for understanding those connections. I got with you just a couple of examples. Vulnerati and King, 2008, is very inspiring piece of research with Albanians, elderly Albanians and their relatives in Greece. And the paper is not about that, but when you read the narratives of the people, you can see that many elderly in Albania were so concerned about dying without meeting their children, their adult children again. We have seen something similar, for example, in Tania Bastia 2015, work with Bolivians in Spain, and Paolo Boccagni research with care workers in Italy. Many of the participants highlight the issue of the concern because the people they are looking after died. But at some point, I see that death is so significant in many of these pieces I am quoting in this slide. But when you look into the detail, what is the meaning of dying in this particular context and how that shapes your ideas of home, there is not much about this discussion. I am primarily drawing on this, you can see in the triangle of saying aging, migration, and home. This already several quotes I had here. I find that all these scholars exploring the connection talk about that. Just an example, Buffel 2015, for example, in the piece with first generation Turkish migrants in Brussels, many mention in the narratives their concern for dying. So I really want to push forward what happened with this relationship. Going into the empirical findings, I want to provide one example for those who are aging in Ecuador and Peru, and one example for those aging in Spain. Sorry?
5 minutes.
Okay, that is fine. So Yolanda is 62 and she is aging in Lima, and I am saying based on her narrative, afraid of dying without seeing her daughter who lives in Manchester again. Yolanda had been living in the same flat, in the same house indeed, for 52 years. And she rarely feels at home in that particular space, largely because her son died and her daughter now lives in Manchester. And she has been wishing to become what is so called in the literature a flying grandmother, but because of the visa rejection twice, she couldn't really never visit her daughter. And when I talk, or when we discuss the idea of home, she said, I have this space, I have been living all my life here, but to me, home is family, so I don't really feel that place is my home. When my visa was rejected, I just realized that there is a war between us, between Lima and between Manchester, but between her and her daughter. So, and she just shared with me the photos of her daughter in different moments of her life, and just provide this, what I found very interesting, part of her narrative. Year after year, I am more and more concerned about dying without seeing her again. I know she loves me, and I can't tolerate the idea of seeing my daughter rushing to find a flight ticket to Lima just to see my dead body in a coffin. I don't want to cause her such a pain. What about the experience of those aging in Madrid? Gloria, 57 by the time I interviewed her, is what I trying to say, is searching for home in her father's grave back in Quito. Why? She just left Quito, left her 4 children with her father. Her father died. At that time, she was an undocumented migrant in Spain, and she couldn't go back to Ecuador to look after her father. And her father asked her to promise, please stay there, just try to bring your children, but keep there. And she's reflecting about this experience after 20 years and said, it was a really tough decision, and I can change it now. I can only regret it. And I found that regret is a significant issue in the experience of those who are aging in place, because they can't pardon themselves for not being able to look after their families and attending their parent funerals. When I asked her, okay, and how do you deal with that? She said, how can you recover from that? There is no way to overcome this sorrow. Every single day, I think about my father and often imagine his life here in this house with us in Spain. And then she started to explain to me how she managed that, and she often travels back to Ecuador once every 5 years. And she explained to me the existential need to go to the grave of her father to say, sorry, father, I couldn't be here, but you are here in my heart. So that is significant in the way many of these people have been really struggling to feel at home in Europe. Conclusions and perhaps implications. Death and funerals complicate the experience of home in later life, not just for those who are left behind, inverted commas, but for those who are aging in place in European cities. What I have found is that those aging in Ecuador and Peru often experience the sense of being homeless in their own houses because the death of some of their relatives and the migration of others. And those who are aging in place struggling to feel at home in Europe because this sense of regret and nostalgia really shaped their everyday life experience of home. Implications of this piece of research, and that's my last point, I am trying to contribute to the so-called experience of comfort they left behind for those who are aging in place. And I believe this piece of research has significant implications for return migration. Many of the people I interviewed in Europe said there is no point to going back there. I have no siblings, I have no parents, no grandparents in my country of origin. So what is the reason to going back there? So this is really an issue, death and funerals, to be explored in return migration. In policy implications, perhaps we can think about family reunification policies, or perhaps just friendly visas for the elderly people. At the end, what I have learned in this piece of research is something that we have perhaps all watching in BBC News when seeing people dying and their relatives just looking through the glasses of the home cares, seeing their parents or grandparents dying and not attending the funeral because of the pandemic. Sadly, we now realize that migrants and refugees have been going through for several years. Perhaps they only need to say, as Gloria, Father, sorry, I want to be here. I want to touch your hand and say goodbye. I am not saying that people can overcome these very complex issues, but what I am trying to suggest is that for many people, the experience of not attending their parents' and grandparents' funerals change their lives and their experience of home in not forever for a significant part of their lives. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Louis. Thank you very much. Very powerful case studies, and I think you do raise some really important issues for future research. We've just gone to our third and final presentation, and I'm delighted to introduce Tania Bastia and Claudia Calcina, who are going to talk about the challenges of transnational care, particularly in a Bolivian context. Both researchers, Tania at the University of Manchester and Claudia at the University of San Simon, have worked extensively in Bolivia and have really carried out some fascinating research looking at older people and their connections with their migrating children. So over to you both. Tania.
There you go. I was trying to unmute myself. There you go. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Suzanne, for organising the webinar. I also want to acknowledge MICRA, who funded part of this project, as well as supporting the webinar today. The brilliant presentation so far. I'm finding it quite hard to follow Luis's presentation as a migrant and as somebody who's lost a family member during the pandemic and wasn't able to go to the funeral. So it really brought back those experiences. I can really identify and feel what you've been talking about. An equally very interesting presentation from Farid and Russell about aging, and I might refer to that in this presentation. So this is a joint book that I'm writing with Claudia. So Claudia is also on the call. I don't know if you want to say hello so people know who you are.
Hi, good morning.
So Claudia is in Bolivia at the moment, so she's it's nice and sunny and much warmer than here in the UK. I'm presenting, and not because I'm particularly fast at speaking like Russell is, but just because Claudia is still gaining her confidence with her English. But Claudia's really been part of this project since the beginning in 2013. And I'll say a little bit more about that. So why aging and migration, and why Bolivia? So what we'd like to do with this work is really make a contribution to our understanding of how people care transnationally. So Baldassar and her co-authors in 2007 have already shown that transnational care is possible, that you don't need physical proximity to care for family members. But we would like to explore whether this is available to everyone. So obviously there's been quite significant work since 2007. In particular, I found the work by Magela Kilke and Laura Merla from 2014 quite useful. They've explored the importance of state policies and international regulations for the maintenance of transnational family solidarity. And what we wanted to do with this project that I'm referring to today is understand what this transnational care looks like from the country of origin, and from one where there are very few institutional resources for all the people, but also very varied migration streams. So we also recognize that there is definitely work on aging in developing countries, but it is limited in comparison with the existing work on aging in higher income countries, and it's also quite scattered in quite different bodies of literature. And also that most of the work on aging and migration has focused on Western countries. And as King and Russell King and Ayalula have argued in, that should be 2020, not 2019, we still need to fully understand the relationship between aging, migration, and development. So the other thing to say here is that quite a lot of work continues to focus on south-north migration, but we also know that almost half of all migrations take place between countries of the global south or regional migration. So in this project, we're also looking comparatively to some extent between comparing south-south and south-north migration. So there's only so much that I can go into today. But today I'll just like to give you an overview of what we're engaging with. And why Bolivia? Well, Bolivia is a very diverse country with a long history of migration that varies significantly across its regions. And despite recent improvements, it's also one of the poorest countries in the Latin American region. And there are also practical aspects of why Bolivia. I've been doing long-term work on migration in Bolivia, and for this kind of work, I think it's very important to have to be able to have good contacts both with researchers locally as well as accessing interviewees. In terms of the project background, this is a very long and thin project. MICRA funded the first phase with a pilot of 22 interviews in the Department of Cochabamba. Then the British Academy funded the second phase with 40 interviews in Santa Cruz and Tarija, and currently we're in the third phase, which is funded by the LiveHume. Another 40 interviews in Oruro and La Paz. So altogether, we're looking at 101 interviews across 5 different regions. And what we try to address and focus on is understanding the consequences that migration of the adult children has for the migrants' parents. So we interviewed both men and women over the age of 60 who have some children abroad. We included both south-to-south and south-north migrations, as I've already explained, and sampled interviewees across rural, urban, and peri-urban areas. So within the different regions, we also included a number of speakers of the main indigenous languages, Quechua, Aymara, Guarani, and Guaraya speakers. And I want to stress that this is a very collaborative project, and it wouldn't have been able to take place without the support of CESU, which is part of the University of San Simon, where Claudia works, as well as the community of, this is a community research project, HAINA, which is based in the south of Bolivia. And I just want to mention Maria Esther Pozo, who participated at the beginning of the project particularly, Sara Roquero Cavado, who helped with interviews at the beginning and towards the end of the project, Carmen Paiva, who helped with interviews in Santa Cruz, Doña Angela, who helped with interviews in Guarani, Doña Mirta, who helped with interviews in Guarayo, and Pilar Lizárraga and Carlos Vaca Flores, who helped with interviews in Tarija, and they're the main researchers in Haina. So for those of you who are not very familiar with the geography, this is Cochabamba. Migration here is very varied. So the interviewees had children in Argentina, Brazil, Europe, as well as the US. In Santa Cruz, it was mostly migration towards Spain and a very feminist migration stream. In Tarija, it was mostly migration towards the north of Argentina, so it's a very cross-border migration, mostly to work in the rural areas of north of Argentina. In La Paz, interviewees had their children abroad in the US, as well as Brazil and places, different countries in Europe. And in Oruro, as well as the traditional migration to Argentina, they also had children in Chile, as well as some in the US. So in terms of just giving you an overview, as you've seen, each region is very different. Migration is very widespread, but some children generally stayed behind, and we were, well, I was surprised about this to some extent. I was expecting to find the orphan pensioners that Russell and Julie wrote about in their research in Albania, but there were very few interviewees who fitted that type. And one of the things that, so there are three main things that we're currently exploring. So initially, we tried to make sense of the differences across rural, urban, and peri-urban areas. And what we found was that through the migration, the pre-existing inequalities between rural, urban, and peri-urban areas were being reproduced. And we're currently exploring whether we're looking at transnational care, but looking at the consequences and the effects of migration on material resources, on hands-on care, and on emotional care.
4 minutes.
Sorry?
4 minutes.
4 minutes, great. And what we found was that temporality is a very significant factor in explaining how the parents relate emotionally to their children's migration, particularly at the time of the interviews. So in Tarija, for example, some of the children started migrating when they were 13, 14 years old. And we're now interviewing parents who are in their 60s and 70s. So there was a gap of about 30, sometimes 40 years from when migration happened to the time of the interview. So that was very important in terms of explaining how interviewees related emotionally with their children's migration. And the other factor was how prevalent migration was in that region. So in some places it was expected that children would migrate, for example, as a result of land fragmentation in Cochabamba or lack of water in Tarija. So in a way, as children were growing up, the parents were expecting them to make those choices. So just briefly on these three main aspects, in terms of material resources, one thing to stress here is that only a small minority of interviewees had access to a pension. So this is quite common in lower income countries. Only less than 20% of interviewees had access to a private pension. But on the other hand, most interviewees own their homes, so not owning a home was a very significant kind of marker of vulnerability. Almost everyone was in receipt of the state cash transfer, which is called Renta Dignidad, which is given to everyone over the age of 60, and this was a significant income stream particularly for interviewees in rural areas. And about half of all interviewees continued working, including working on the land, regardless of their age, because they had very little alternative. And this is supported by other work by Armando Barrientos, for example, which argues that in countries with a very large informal sector, people just have to continue working, which is very interesting. Then comparing this with the aging types that Russell and Farid talked about. And also very interestingly, only a minority received remittances from their children abroad. So on average, this was less than 40%, but a large variation between, for example, 50% in Santa Cruz and only about 11% in Oruro. Then in terms of hands-on care, we're also surprised to find very few interviewees who needed everyday hands-on care. So there was one exception in one of the interviews that Claudia did in La Paz with somebody who needed round-the-clock care, and all of her children were abroad, but this was really an exceptional case. It was much more common for interviewees to state that they've never been to the doctor and that they were quite healthy and keeping well, and they were basically keeping their fingers crossed that this would continue, because access to Western healthcare, particularly in rural areas, was very, very limited. So we came across people who, for example, had heart attacks and other kind of serious conditions, and they were just given basically some paracetamol and sent home. But the other thing to stress here is that the interviewees were both receivers of care as well as giving care, and quite a few had caring responsibilities towards grandchildren, but these were not necessarily of the children abroad. So in terms of emotional care, I've already said that this depended on temporality and the history of migration, but there was also a very interesting gender component here, particularly in relation to the women, the mother-daughter relationship. And it was much more common, for example, for women to say that they had a period of depression after the children left, and particularly in urban areas. So it was a very gendered and urban experience. But in what we could make sense of this, most interviewees had strong, solid social networks. The other things that we looked at was access to communication, and this had improved significantly since we started the research in 2013. So in the last rounds of interviews, most of the interviewees had access to WhatsApp and mobile phones, but this wasn't the case in 2013. And interviewees were also very active in civil society organizations.
Just a minute.
Yeah, I'll skip the challenges so I can come back to that in the discussion. So just to conclude, we would say that transnational care is indeed possible, but that the classical understanding of transnational care as caring across transnational social fields is generally only available for the better off migrants' parents, those who have children who engage with legal and more skilled forms of migration, who have access to technology, medical services, and some financial security. So this doesn't mean that the remaining parents lack or experience vulnerabilities. And in fact, here we would refer to the work of Joconda Herrera, for example, who's critiqued the global care chains literature and argued that it's not so much that there is a lack of care when the main carer migrates, but that there is a reconfiguration of care arrangements. And yeah, so just finally, I would say that the other thing that we would like to look at is internal migration, which is much more widespread, but might have similar consequences. So I think I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Tanya. Well, we have some time for 6 minutes, I think, for questions. So if people would like to put some questions in the chat function, and I'll group those. If you could identify yourself, that would be very, very good. While those are coming through, just a question, I guess, for the presenters. I wonder, do you think there's a case for some sort of organized transnational social policy? I know that sounds very idealistic, but given some of the issues which migrants have to carry in terms of supporting relatives, do you think that's feasible to develop in some way? Russell, do you want to just respond to that, perhaps?
Yeah, sure. I think Farid has left us. I was going to ask him to take responsibility for the questions, but he has to teach at 3, so he's probably just left us. Yeah, I mean, this really came across very strongly in the Bangladeshi case with this increasing harshness of the visa regime. I mean, people who had been able to visit in the past and who'd, demonstrated good faith by going back to Bangladesh afterwards, because of course the fear amongst the paranoid British authorities is that people will come and then not return. But people who had demonstrated a history of coming and going were then, subsequently refused visas in the most heartrending circumstances. I mean, I was very touched with Luis's accounts of death and dying. So I mean, whether there could be some kind of international social protection towards, the right to visit. I mean, it's about the right to visit at crucial moments. that would seem, it would seem to all of us, I'm sure, a good idea. But how to operationalize it, I'm not sure. Probably it's just up to each country. But I mean, unfortunately, the UK is singularly heartless in its approach at the moment.
Yes, willing to profit from the benefits of migration, but not willing to take the responsibility for some of the pressures on migrants. Absolutely, yeah. Louis, do you want to just respond? Because I thought your case studies were very moving and did bring out some of these terrible experiences which people have.
I am really sorry, I couldn't really understand the question. Could you just?
Well, is there a case for could we develop some sort of transnational social policy response to some of the issues that you raised?
Okay, now thank you very much. Yeah, it's difficult to say, but I was, when writing this paper, thinking about, for example, the humanitarian visas. When people disregard their legal status in a country, can just travel to attend specific events. So I was thinking, for example, in the case of people who were undocumented at that time, it's difficult just to go to somewhere else and say, I need to go to my country, but then I need to go back here. But if you can find some ways to get this status that have been used, for example, in the context of war or something like that, maybe. I don't know how, and I really need to think about this, but I do believe that there are issues that can be managed very easily. For example, having friendly visa applications for elderly people, because in many cases, what we learn is that people just want to visit for a week, for 2 weeks, for a month, their relatives. And when you submit an application for a visa, I'm sorry to use the example of the UK, you need to show that you have a huge amount of money in your bank account, but this is the same in Australia or in the United States. So how people can afford all these elements, we really need to think about the connection, the people, because yeah, it's like, it's not my problem at some point that, yeah, the people who are just making decisions in people's lives that shape their experience for a significant part of their time. So, yeah.
No, that's very helpful. There's a question from, or an observation from Holly Marland. Does research of the kind we've been discussing get presented at the all-party parliamentary group on migration? I wonder, Tanya, have you come across the all-party parliamentary group on migration to present your work?
Come across it, but I've never presented. I'd be happy to.
Yeah, but that may be worth exploring, mayn't it? For and there's a question for Louis. One brief response: did you come across different interpretations of home? For instance, home as an imagined place versus home as a geographical place with material connotations?
Thank you very much for that question. A very quick response. Yes, people use the word home in many ways. Many were referring, for example, to their country of origin. I mean, the migrants in the interview in Europe. But those who were living in their countries of origin rarely use the term home to refer to their country. They often refer to more the family connections, the relation they have with different places in their communities, for example, and often to the people who migrate. So there is this balance between the emotional, the symbolic, or the existential. The grave could become a home for people who can't travel to their parents' funeral to say, sorry, I wasn't here. So unfortunately, we don't have more time to really explore.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that. Now, normally at the end of MICRA seminars, we finish with a couple of glasses of wine. We cannot do that, unfortunately, on this occasion.
What?
But I'll raise, well, I've got a cup of tea here. I'll raise that to all the speakers who've done a fantastic job, to the marvelous participants. We've had nearly 60 people, well, I think over 60 people at various points, which shows the interest in this area. I'd like to thank Suzanne Booth, who's done a great job in putting everything together and organizing things. Just a reminder that this has been recorded and should be on the MICRA website next week. So as chair, and would like to thank Tanya Bastia again, who has really done a lot of the inspiration in terms of bringing everything together. Well, have a safe December, everybody, and do join another MICRA workshop. There'll be a number in the new year, and I'm sure we'll follow this one up. So many thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.